So this is going to be a pretty weird and abrupt start to a video, so please persevere with me, but I've just got to spend a bit of time explaining from the off what I'm trying to do here. This is the first of 3 videos which I've branded Remaking the JRPG, and what I want to do in these videos is look at 3 JRPGs, all released in the last few years, which were developed with nostalgia and old school sentimentality in mind. My aim here isn't to suggest how a JRPG should be remade, but rather, given that these games are all meant to reflect aspects of the genre's history, to simply have a look at how these games hold up in a more modern gaming landscape, and to try and figure out if there still exists a place in said landscape for games that draw inspiration from the old JRPG formula. The main focus of each video will still strictly be the game in question, and although I'll absolutely bring up references to other games when necessary, the idea is still to critically look at whatever that particular game is. We're going to be loosely boiling this all down to 4 main categories, which you can see on the screen now, all of which are for me hallmarks of the genre, and this will help us more closely analyse what each of these games has going for them. The 3 games we're going to take a deep dive into are I Am Setsuna, Lost Sphear, and finally Octopath Traveler. And first up is I Am Setsuna, so let's get to it. And there will be spoilers for the whole game here, essentially. It's tough to do a deep dive and keep it spoiler free, so now you know. Anyway, to fully understand what I Am Setsuna is all about, it's worth looking a bit more into the background of this game's development. Setsuna, which is what I'll call it sometimes, so I don't have to say I Am Setsuna every single time, was made by a team aptly called Tokyo RPG Factory, which is a subsidiary of Square Enix. If you head onto their website, you'll get an immediate idea of what their mission is in making games. Straight away, you're met with a statement: "Countless adventures captivated us when we were kids, now it's time for us to return the favour with adventures of our own," which is a message I'm sure a lot of us can get behind. With an entire team dedicated to recreating classics from the golden age of JRPGs, it makes sense that they take a lot of inspiration from their parent company, if you will, with the Final Fantasy games and Chrono Trigger playing the biggest roles in this instance. We'll get more into that in a second. Beforehand, I'd like to briefly go into the premise of this game and outline a few of the introductory plot points. So this all happens within the first half hour or so, by the way. You play as a masked mercenary named Endir, tasked with the murder of a young woman, the eponymous Setsuna. As you make your way towards fulfilling your mission, you learn a bit about her. It turns out she's actually about to embark on a pilgrimage, the end goal of which is to give her own life to appease the ever-growing monster population. At this point you think, well, if she's gonna die anyway, might as well see her to the end of her journey. And alongside Setsuna's mysterious friend Eterna, you set off on your long, arduous mission to the Last Lands, to put the world to rights once more. Straight off the bat, something's immediately clear here. This is just the story of Final Fantasy X. Setsuna goes on a pilgrimage to save the world, Yuna goes on a pilgrimage to pretty much save the world. The Last Lands in this game mirror the Calm Lands in Final Fantasy X. The Sacrifice's Guard in Setsuna harkens back to Yuna's Guardians. It's even a family affair. Setsuna's mother was a sacrifice before, as was Yuna's father Braska. This isn't even all of the parallels, and we've barely started. We'll get more into it soon as well, but this isn't the only example of copy and pasted features either. And to be perfectly honest, this first 30 minutes sums up everything you need to know about I Am Setsuna. Without meaning to sound too contradictory, this reliance on the past is both one of the game's greatest strengths and one of its most glaring weaknesses. It's a definite drawback that Setsuna's story is essentially plagiarism, but simultaneously it's positive that it's at least using the blueprint of a really strong plot. And when it comes to the story of this game as a whole, this blatant mimicry ends up being perhaps what edges the story out of comfortable mediocrity. It's honestly kind of bizarre, but I Am Setsuna is, in practice, an example of a game being inherently oxymoronic. Almost everything good that the game has to offer is paired with something less palatable, some sort of disappointing accompaniment. One of the best examples of this throughout the story is that although the game has a few pretty decent plot twists, like discovering who Setsuna's real father is, and that it follows some intriguing, albeit slightly overcomplicated narrative pathways like Eterna's time manipulation stuff near the end, it all still feels too familiar, too telegraphed, and this eliminates the element of surprise from most of the game, which really limits its storytelling power. Although there's very little actively wrong with I Am Setsuna's plot, it tends to leave you in some sort of narrative limbo, where predictability leads to it being difficult to properly invest in the story. However, it's not all bleak. A real strength that the narrative of this game has is the confidence and assurance with which it dedicates itself to theme, and this game's singular, most overarching theme is that of melancholy. Just proper, unadulterated sadness. One thing that's somewhat refreshing about I Am Setsuna is that although a lot of the game's other aspects are reaching a bit too much, again as we'll see soon, the thematic portrayal isn't. You can argue that it doesn't vary enough, and I think depending on your preferences you could have a point. Therein lies this whole positive-negative dichotomy. But I personally really like that there are very few highs throughout the story, and that the harsh and cold reality of the game's plot is never really lost on the cast. Obviously, the environmental design goes a long way to helping out with this, and we'll delve more into that later on, but it must be said that at least from this perspective, Tokyo RPG Factory knew what they wanted to do and made sure to achieve it. It's just a shame this can't be said for some other things in the game. You could say that this is me being pretty harsh though, as Setsuna's story can just be enjoyed in a very surface level way, but I don't think that's good enough for a game like this. Setsuna's originality is dwarfed by its inspiration, and one of the most obvious examples of this is in the game's characters. My intention in these 3 videos is not at all to make them, here's how these games compare to Final Fantasy, but it is going to come up at points, especially this one, and I'm sorry about that. Why I'm mentioning it here is that, just like what we've talked about a bit from the story, a lot of ideas have been borrowed from that series, which is again kind of the most consistent aspect of I Am Setsuna, this concept of trying to reach back into the past and grab all of the best bits. This unavoidably seeps into the characters too, with most characters having some sort of pre-existing and frankly better JRPG archetype. And to be honest, if you look, almost every link here is just found in Final Fantasy 9 and 10. Setsuna is clearly meant to imitate Yuna from her story to her demeanor. Nider, or however the fuck you're meant to pronounce his name, is pretty much a carbon copy of Auron, a grizzly warrior with a huge sword, a troubled past, not to mention a less than savory experience and a previous pilgrimage. Kira is essentially a budget Vivi from Final Fantasy IX, a young precocious black magic user who hails from a hidden forest town, who muses on existentialism and the meaning of life, and Julienne, a formidable spear-wielding warrior princess who wants nothing more than to see her home brought back to its former glory. Take out the word princess there, and you've also got Freya from Final Fantasy IX. The main character Endir is essentially a blank canvas who carries very little personality at all. What's more, according to the game's developers, your protagonist wears a mask so that his opinions and emotions are actually harder to glean. I imagine the thought process here is to allow the player to try and imprint some of themselves onto him, which would perhaps work alongside the occasional dialogue choice you're afforded if he wasn't, for all intents and purposes, just a silent protagonist. One other character-centric thing that is worth bringing up though is one of my least favourite things in JRPGs, and this game is guilty of it unfortunately. It's when you get your final party member but far too late into the game. I honestly cannot fathom why games do this at all. In this instance, you recruit one of the game's recurring bosses, a scythe-wielding bloke called Fides, but essentially just before the final boss. Why? Why is this a thing? It just leads to a disconnect in your party and the way you approach the game. You've had time to build up a rapport with the other characters and get used to how they function, both in a narrative and a more practical sense. And then suddenly you just get handed another, when there's hardly any time to integrate them. For me, he ends up feeling more like a guest party member than the actual permanent fixture you're looking for in the final stages of a JRPG. Though again, to backtrack a smidge, this has been a pretty negative segment so far, but it isn't all awful. Even though the characters are all pretty reminiscent of other characters throughout the genre's history, pretty much none of them are terrible. I think it would be a straight up lie to say they were great, but again, they lie in this dangerous middle ground where they're fine, albeit kind of forgettable. Here's what it comes down to. The biggest pitfall is simply that the game doesn't do a very good job of getting you to really care about the characters, which is one of the strengths of the JRPGs that this is trying to simulate. Every character gets a decent amount of attention and time dedicated to their own personal story and struggle, but I couldn't help but just feel like, well, okay, cool. I think this partly ties into the predictability we mentioned earlier on. A small nitpicky example is that you get the option to name all your party members before you're actually sure they'll join your party, which is a massive giveaway that I found irritating. And a much bigger, more important nitpick is that I was never worried about Setsuna dying at the end, for example. If she did, okay. If she didn't, okay too. Having a game engender such ambivalence towards the ultimate fate of a character, which in this instance is intrinsically linked to the whole plot structure, is a pretty significant misstep. This partly comes down to the writing too. Games like this must shine in this regard, and in a game without full voice acting, it's purely down to the writing to give the characters life and personality. Setsuna succeeds in bringing endearing JRPG cliches along for the ride, but it fails to deliver anything truly engaging. You see, what JRPGs have above most other genres in my opinion is a focus on the character-driven narrative, the complex interwoven plots, and here it either tips towards too simple or too complex, never perfectly balanced. And generally these games are longer than the average game, and perhaps this extended amount of time you spend with the game helps you develop an affinity over time. I Am Setsuna is a game that lasts at a stretch between 15 and 20 hours, which really isn't much for a JRPG, but I don't think this is the sole reason for the lack of connection I had with the game's plot and characters, but rather just a contributing factor. It's just a shame there are so many contributing factors. The story does the bare minimum to invest you in the result of the journey, even though it does arguably more than necessary to convey the journey's theme. It would work a lot better if the medium, and this genre in particular, didn't rely on investment for a lot of its impetus. However, this being said, I wouldn't say narrative investment has much bearing on the strength of the combat and gameplay in any given JRPG. Does this salvage this game from the mire of mediocrity it's currently stuck in? We'll deal with combat first and foremost before anything else. So if I Am Setsuna has drawn from Final Fantasy for concept, you can bet it's drawn from Chrono Trigger in practice. Combat is a vital component of any JRPG, considering how much time you spend doing it, and it needs to be balanced and paced perfectly throughout the whole game in order to fulfill its role most effectively. What Setsuna does is lift the tried and tested battle system from Chrono Trigger, a system we can all probably agree is about as good as the ATB system gets. It takes a lot of the best parts, like AoE attacks, combo moves and all that, and then decides, you know what, how about we just make this all abnormally complex? I like when combat is challenging in JRPGs. For example, this year I played Persona 3 for the first time, and some of the battles in that game are like properly challenging. But for me at least it worked, because it always felt nonetheless achievable. The Persona games have a simple enough combat system, but they tend to put their difficulty in the right place, which tends to be the enemies, and you making the right calls depending on the situation, not making the system itself inherently difficult. This is problematic because I Am Setsuna is a laughably easy game, with a combat system that does not at all fit that difficulty because it is far too deep. The combat system has an obscene amount of customizability, and I feel like a bit of a hypocrite complaining about this, because depth in combat is something I absolutely adore. I'd go so far as to say it's almost vital for creating a combat system that stays just as engaging from start to finish. What the problem here is that there's no need for it. Not only that, the options are a bit overwhelming. We'll touch on this more in a minute or two. This refers more to the equipment and behind the scenes than the actual battles. The battles themselves are very simple, and do have some positives to them. One is that they use a system called momentum, which means that you can choose to wait in battle, and the longer you wait, the more you build up the ability to bolster whatever action it is you choose through a button input after selection. I like this. It makes you consider a little bit of strategy and adds some depth to the battles. Here's where it gets complicated. In order to use abilities in this game, called techs, you have to equip something called Spritnite, which I have no idea how to pronounce either, by the way. Is it Spritnite? Spritnite? Spritnit? I don't know. I'm going to call it Spritnite. They sound dumb anyway, all of them. Doesn't matter. So you equip the relevant Spritnite of whatever tech it is you want to use, right? And that's absolutely fine. That works, I can get behind that. And then we get something called Fluxation, which is something that randomly occurs when you use one of your techs with momentum, and it has a chance to impart the ability that's pre-existing on the talisman you have equipped, which is like an accessory. And this Fluxation attaches itself to the tech you used as a permanent passive bonus whenever you use it again in the future. Like, what's going on? Plus, aforementioned singularities, which are little timed events that rarely happen in battle for seemingly no reason at all, and will give you a little bonus, which is like ATB loading speed is increased, or something along those lines. The game itself doesn't even really explain how to get singularities, claiming that their true cause is unknown. Great, that's fantastic, but can this just be clearer? There's all this stuff going on in the background, and so many more important features are omitted. Visual AoE range is absent here, for example, but it's luckily fixed in Lost Sphear. Details about what certain Fluxation effects actually are, or what techs you should equip to get certain combos between characters. There's a seemingly endless number of talismans and techs with varying purposes, so few of which have any impact on any of the battles. It's like they're there for decoration or something. The balance in the combat is so off-kilter because all challenge is removed when you figure out that you can just use a combo skill called Blowbeat and annihilate almost every mob in the game. Combat stops being enjoyable and becomes a simple hurdle to jump over, and the straightforwardness of it all stops the depth from ever being necessary. Why spend time trawling through equipment and abilities and optimizing stuff where you can, which is all some of my favourite stuff to do in JRPGs, when all you actually have to do is just essentially rinse and repeat the same overpowered thing each battle? One aspect of the game that would maybe make you reconsider how you go about that is that you earn different items for defeating enemies in certain ways, which actually go towards how you buy new techs, and I like this idea, but in practice, again, most of it just isn't necessary and a lot just won't get used. It's a shame and a glaring parallel to the story aspect we spoke about earlier on. So much inspiration is taken from other games, Chrono Trigger in this particular instance, but the finesse and fine-tuning that you'd expect just isn't there, and this leaves this game really lacking that soul that draws you in. It's like, I feel like you could basically stop playing this game any time and not really think about it after. Like, I'd be surprised if you were ever desperate to see what happens next in the story, or desperate to see, like, what the combat's going to throw at you next, or anything along those lines. But all is not lost. What we are going to get into finally is the world of this game and how we interact with it. So I'm going to let you know right away, although it's not going to be completely positive, this is going to be the most positive part of the video. Most of my favourite things about I Am Setsuna are encompassed within its aesthetics, its feel, and its environment. We've spoken about theme already, and I imagine you've gathered from the footage you've been looking at this whole time that the theme and appearance of this game are inextricably linked. Setsuna is a really snowy game. Snow is everywhere you look, every individual locale looks pretty similar, and there's little to no aesthetic deviation in this regard. What you see at the start is essentially what you get for the whole game, and although there are some small oversights throughout, some quality of life fixes that could have been beneficial, like having a map on the overworld for example, there's a lot of attention to detail when it comes to the visuals. I love the trail you leave in the snow as you trudge through it, for example, and even though it's such an inconsequential, minor feature, I feel like it's kind of what the game needs. It adds that little extra fragment of reality to the game, which helps with the world building. It's interesting to take such a single-minded route when the games that it's attempting to emulate are entirely in opposition to this direction. Chrono Trigger, for example, takes you to all sorts of varying locales, but I think actually deserves a lot of credit that the developers managed to create such thematic strength thanks to their steadfast determination to the concept. It really is quite a stunning game in some ways, despite the technical limitation. What isn't so stunning, though, is the lack of creativity in dungeon design. I could get behind the world map and towns all being quite samey. I think it helps create that somber tone that the game was trying so hard to instill. But the dungeons are just pretty appalling, honestly. Recycled, reused, and uninspired settings and textures are ubiquitous, not to mention countless enemy reskins. It's tough to get enthusiastic about pretty much every dungeon in the game being lazily designed. It's fine that it's linear, but it's just so insipid. It's a real shame because it undercuts the lovely, simplistic, and honest appeal of the other aesthetic components of the game. And if we're talking lovely, simplistic, and honest, you can't look further than the music. The music is absolutely one of my favourite parts of the whole game. The entire soundtrack is comprised of a single piano, and it's wonderful. It matches the tone of the game perfectly, and is the only instance where I actually don't really have a negative to go alongside the positive. It somehow straddles that line between despairing and joyful, between foreboding and hopeful, and the minimalism of the musical direction adds that perfect finishing touch to the game's environmental design. It's odd to say, but I feel like this would be a much better game if it just wasn't a JRPG though. The elements that are the bread and butter of the genre are weak, and that's a real shame. I'm not sure what it should be instead, but if this game was to cut out most of its dungeons and almost all of its combat and focus on telling a story and impressing with its tone, environment, and visuals, I think it would be a much more enjoyable experience. So, let's finish it up here. What's disappointing for me above all else is that this game is trying so desperately to relive the golden age of JRPGs, and takes inspiration from so many of my favourite games and tropes, and even with all this potential, it still really let me down. I think its problem lies in the fact that it's just distinctly average. The story is alright, combat at face value is alright, some things are pretty above average and executed well, like the music and atmosphere, but a lot falls below average, like dungeon design, the deeper elements of both the battle and equipment systems, and the general repetition. If we're looking at how this game fares nowadays, and compared to its inspiration, it doesn't really do a great job of matching them at all, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a place in today's gaming landscape. I just believe that the value in this game comes from viewing it not as much as a JRPG, and I think that the less you know about the genre would perhaps make it more of an appealing prospect. All in all, I Am Setsuna leans almost too heavily on the past, relies too much on tropes of the genre, but never strikes the right balance between novel and recognisable. Part of it really tries to push the boat out, and the other half still desperately clings to the genre's halcyon days. Unfortunately, this leaves the game stranded in the middle, without many glaring issues, but it must be said, without much of its own identity. So, that's us looked at the first of the 3 games. Next up is Lost Sphear. So yeah, thank you for watching. If you watched all this way, it's very much appreciated. The next video will be out a week after this is released, so hopefully I'll see you back here for that. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed or want to see more of my content in the future, and thanks again. See you next time.